Welcome to the series Reinvent American Foreign Policy, where today we're going to be looking at how to mitigate the global unemployment crisis. I'm Pete Leiden. I'm the founder of Reinvent, and I'm also going to be helping moderate this conversation in the background a little bit today. Now, we've had a dozen of these virtual roundtable discussions in this series so far, and one of the main themes that's emerged over the course of all these conversations is how do we kind of reshape American foreign policy to move from more militaristic approaches to more diplomatic ones? It's been coming up over and over again in a lot of these conversations as we move towards a much more globalized world. Today we're going to be looking at a third approach, you could think of it, is economic development and how to stimulate it abroad. So a lot of the countries that really pose the most serious national security challenges to the United States are countries that are underdeveloped countries with devastated economies and very high levels of unemployment. And these kind of conditions often can create the conditions to kind of radicalize the population, particularly younger men with not much to do. And it's in that context that they can lead to global terrorism. It can lead to kind of destabilizing regions much like what we're seeing in the Middle East today. So what is an American foreign policy that could stimulate much higher levels of growth in these areas? How can we kind of counteract these tendencies? What is the role of not just the government, but also the role of private sector investors, other non-state actors? And given that beyond more foreign aid, which is probably not forthcoming from the United States, what are the kind of other things that we could use to change the game in these regions? And to help us work with this very difficult but interesting problem, we've got a terrific anchor, as we call it, Rob Johnson. Now, Rob is he is the president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, which is a fantastic network, you could say, of next generation economists, kind of really fundamentally rethinking economic policy and economic kind of theory at its foundations. He's also the director of the Global Finance Project for the Roosevelt Institute. Before these think tank kind of days, you could say, he also, in the private sector, was a managing director of the Soros Fund Management, in which his portfolio specialized on emerging markets, so he has some great expertise there. And he's also spent some time in government. He was the chief economist for the U.S. Senate Banking Committee back in the day. And so he brings that kind of perspective as well from inside government. And the thing that really qualifies him and is we're most proud of is that he's also been an anchor at a previous roundtable in this series and did a fantastic job. So we've got a real pro here. So we thank Rob for taking the time to do this, and we also thank our partners in this whole series, the Plowshares Fund, and three key individuals have been instrumental in getting off the ground and supporting it. That's Guy Saperstein, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, and Dan Berger. So besides Rob and the crew, we've got a fantastic crew today, and what we're going to do is just introduce them and have them just say a word about what they bring to the table. So first, let's go with Bob. Robert Hormats, who's the former Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. Bob, do you want to talk a little bit about your background in terms of this issue?
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. It's a great theme, and I think very important, as you point out, to American foreign policy. I was, as you point out, Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment under Hillary Clinton, and spent a lot of time on these development issues and how the U.S. can connect with the aspirations and the concerns of people in developing countries in particular, and focusing specifically on younger people because many of these countries have large populations of youth. Before that, I was at Goldman Sachs 25 years. I was vice chairman Goldman Sachs International. Before that, I was in government and the State Department, U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and the National Security Council staff, and currently I'm Vice Chairman of Kissinger Associates in New York.
We are very honored to have you on this with your background. Thanks so much for joining us. So then we've also got Pavlina Tcherneva, and she is the chair of the Economics Department at Bard College. And Pavlina, do you want to give us a little bit more of your background in terms of this issue? Oops, you're muted. Slightly muted.
Hi everyone. It's great to be here. I am a macroeconomist. I'm mostly interested in the question of why have we increasingly gotten used to jobless growth recoveries. What is it about the way we stabilize the economy, the way we conduct macroeconomic policy that is failing us in generating jobs. So in my research, I work on sort of diagnosing the problem, hopefully in an innovative way, and looking at the causes and effects of mass unemployment. And then I'm interested in the question of how do we rethink counter-cyclical macroeconomic stabilization? How do we rethink the safety net to tackle mass unemployment? More specifically, I have studied and worked on direct employment programs around the world. Specifically studied the Plan Jefes program in Argentina, which was a very large-scale direct employment policy program. And so I've looked at similar programs around the world and how they impact beneficiaries and young people in particular.
Well, fantastic to have you here. Appreciate you coming, and looking forward to what you have to say. Daniel Alpert is the founding managing partner of Westwood Capital. He's a frequent commentator in the meeting. Daniel, do you want to talk a little bit about your background?
Sure. I am managing partner of Westwood Capital. It's an investment bank operating in North America, Latin America, and Pacific Asia. Have been working also as a fellow at the Century Foundation in economics for a period of time. I published a book and many white papers on a subject I call oversupply, which is sort of the mirror image of insufficient demand, and has a lot of very interesting aspects to it that I think are something we will be talking about a little bit more today. I've worked with several of the people on the panel in the past, very happily so, and look forward to contributing.
Well, it's great to have you here. So the final person we got here is David Bank, who's the CEO and editor of ImpactAlpha, and he's been all over the emerging story of impact investing and its growing impact on the world. David, you want to give us a little bit of your background?
Thanks, Pete. It's great to be here. Yeah, I'm a journalist by background and spent some time at the Wall Street Journal. A few years back, got onto this story of this emerging trend of and shift of capital towards what people are calling impact investments, which are investments that have environmental and social benefits and that are specific and measurable, at least in theory. And one of the obvious impacts that people are seeking is sort of better livelihoods, better job prospects for people in emerging economies. So we've been tracking all kinds of investors who are trying to get their heads around how to make those kinds of positive benefits, an investable proposition. And I'm usually interviewing the economists, not going head to head with them, but we take a more of a journalistic approach and try to find investors, try to find entrepreneurs who are making this happen. So it's a little bit of a positive deviance strategy to find the examples that make the case.
And it's great to have you. So now we're back to Rob Johnson. And Rob, it's your show. Why don't you take it from here? Rob? Oops, hang on a second here. Rob, are you hearing us okay? Oh, his screen froze. Huh.
Yes.
Oh, there we go.
I can hear you now. Good. My screen had frozen there for a moment. I'm sorry. I guess there was deficient demand in my corner of the conversation. So we are.
We can hear you fine. Go for it.
We're looking at a world where Reinvent is trying to inspire a transformation of our foreign policy away from what we might call vinegar and towards sugar, away from sticks towards the carrots, away from the military and towards an inclusive economic, incorporation of people from all parts of the world. This has a very appealing dimension to it, which is people are overwhelmed, particularly in Europe right now, with the fear of migration. Locating prosperous economic activity, new ventures, impact investments that have positive spillovers in developing regions would tend to mitigate the pressures of migration and perhaps arrest some of the xenophobic and fearful reactions that we're seeing in the advanced economies. On the other side, the advanced economies themselves have been suffering from what Dan Alpert calls oversupply, or again, deficient demand. And we have a very, very difficult situation of what you might call domestic populations in the era of Marie Le Pen and Donald Trump wanting to be generous about foreign economic policy. They're more concerned about, I'll say, bolting things down right there at home. So I think we have a lot of different pressures related to essentially global governance. We have a lot of pressures related to distress. And then on top of all of this, we have the fear and the prospect of technological innovation, which can both replace people, replace even very smart people with smarter and smarter machines. And on the other hand, innovation holds out the prospect of alleviating many of these stresses. So what I'd like to do is begin with a conversation starting with Dan. What do you see as the way out of a situation of oversupply and deficient demand that can bring these more fruitful and, say, optimistic possibilities to life?
Well, I think it's important to put all this in some context, because what we're dealing here is imperatives on the part of large emerging surplus countries that need to put their people to work. We're dealing with underemployment, and I think it's important to use that word, not just unemployment, but underemployment in developed countries. And we're dealing with the underdeveloped countries themselves who are exporting a considerable amount of political instability around the world. So there's a context that surrounds all of this. And in my opinion, as it has been for the last 8 years, it really harkens back to the end of the large-scale global socialism. We had a huge number of people enter the competitive capitalist markets. And of course, technology and other forms of interlinkage, including trade policy, has just increased the importance of this. The fact is that, you know, when you look at what the developed world was, or the capitalistic world was prior to 25 years ago or so, it was about 800 million people in Japan, Canada, Western Europe, United States. You added about 3.5 billion additional people, creating this condition of massive oversupply of labor, of productive capacity, and of capital, which has clearly driven rates of return down to 0 and negative in terms of risk-free levels. And that's created massive global imbalances. You've got huge wage imbalances. You've got an absence of certain types of employment almost entirely in the West, factory employment that has drained off considerable supportive resources from those countries. You have instability within the developed world. I think you highlighted that very well a few moments ago. Most pronounced in terms of the barbelled electorate here, where you have both a far left and far right guy saying basically the same things about trade. And then you have the issue of those left behind, the completely unstable regions that are exporting some of the political instability. So, looking at this going back, keep in mind that we have some very large powers: China, India, a lot of Brazil, a lot of the other large emerging markets that have an imperative. They need to keep their people employed in order to maintain a level of social harmony. Without that, they are going to, in the case of the purely totalitarian countries, they're going to lose control of their population. In the case of, let's look at Brazil, you're going to have this sort of political instability that you see there from an underperforming economy. So when you put all of this in context, this is actually an opportunity to re-examine, reinvent, to re-examine the entire basis of what we've been gauging our foreign policy and our trade policy on for the last 30 years. The world has changed, and I hope this discussion fleshes some of that out.
Very good. Now, David, you've talked a lot recently and I guess throughout your career about impact investing, about what you might call collateral benefits of some of the investment strategies and policies that might be employed. How would you address this challenge from the vantage point of your experience?
Right. I mean, this tends to be, I think, a little more micro than macro, but there seem to be, there's a lot of opportunities that investors are trying to harness in what have been market failures. I guess one of the big thoughts is the problem is also an opportunity. There are capital gaps that have kept large parts of the population in these countries out of the productive economy in terms of financing for small businesses or financing for smallholder farmers. And the notion is that there are ways to increase the livelihoods of both workers and farmers in particular. I think farmers turn out to be the key population that can also help, for example, global corporations secure their supply chain. So if you can get the kind of mechanisms going where prosperity goes down to people who need work, and where the capital comes from both companies, private investors. There's financial services that are now available on your smartphone, and this is a very this is going gangbusters in East Africa in particular, but other places as well. There are investment opportunities. I mean, off-grid solar in Africa is bringing electricity to lots of people who never had power to run their small business, to stay open later in the evening. There are lots of ways where people's income and livelihood can be increased that are now investable opportunities for private investors. So I think one of the things is this is not just a sort of aid issue anymore, but it's actually an investment issue.
So actually, why don't we go next to Pavlina? Do you want to do a little opening statement on kind of what your thoughts are, honestly, on this?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk a little more about conceptualizing the problem and diagnosing the problem. So, Dan gave us a really good overview of sort of the macro forces that are working against, workers in the global labor market. There are very many pernicious effects from global unemployment and mass unemployment, and so I think that we need to start thinking of global unemployment really more as a sort of an epidemic because of the multiple social costs, environmental costs, political costs that it bears. I mean, not so much from economics, but also from psychology, from the health sciences, we have really good research that looks at the impact of unemployment on people themselves, on their children. We know very well, the link between unemployment and mental and physical problems is very well established. So that is very well documented. What we don't know so much is that there is this kind of negative effect also on the children of the unemployed. There are permanent effects on the loss of social networks, on the loss of social capital, on life satisfaction. I mean, you name it. Literally every socioeconomic problem you can think of is related in one way or another to unemployment. We know that there is a strong link between unemployment and crime. What's interesting is that there is a cyclical link between unemployment and crime. When unemployment rises, so does a certain type of crime. And so, and this research, by the way, comes out of the developed countries. The countries that tend to experience relatively lower rates of unemployment than these regions that we're talking about. So you can multiply, you can imagine how much more complicated the social fallout, the negative externalities are in places that are plagued by persistent double-digit unemployment. And we of course we also see it in Europe. It's a developed region, but countries like Spain and Greece have 40 to 50% youth unemployment. So I think that it's really important to consider this problem as a sort of a health economic epidemic, and the approach to tackling it has to be direct. Like, it has to be inoculated. As economists tend to have fine-tuning policies, right? We attempt to sort of work, incentivize the private sector to do X, Y, and Z, to produce more investment growth and job growth, but we don't seem to be very successful of very aggressively tackling the unemployment situation. So I think nothing short of direct measures, I think, is going to help here. And by that, I really mean, a Marshall Plan for unemployment, a global Marshall Plan for unemployment.
Very good. Bob, you're a specialist in trade, and you and I have had a number of talks about which you might call the role of the United States at the center of a world economy. For many years, it was essentially the market of last resort. It was the magnet to all of the emerging countries coming, or even the countries in reconstruction after the war, and then the emerging countries coming on stream. But it seems as though the United States, based on our primary politics, has a bit of indigestion right now. And the reaction to the TPP legislation is also, not meeting with much approval. How do we continue this trend? What's the chemistry of creating a reinvigorated sense of openness and its possibilities, both here and in the emerging world?
Well, thanks, Rob. I think one issue in this country is that we have a domestic problem, and that is we're always, and have been for decades, a high churn economy with a number of jobs lost, a number of companies closing, but traditionally those have been offset the starting up of a lot of new companies in technology and many other areas. What I think makes trade and the environment for trade more difficult domestically country have slowed down considerably, and therefore, whereas in the past you could make the argument that if there was more competition from abroad, that would displace workers, but those workers would be creation of new jobs, and the pace of that creation has really not kept up, and therefore a lot of people don't feel that the transitions within the American economy are sufficient to offset the displacement. So that's one area domestically that's making our lives more difficult when we try to argue for global trade agreements. The other, of course, is the point that has been made, and that is you're seeing a lot of new producers all around the world and a lot of competition coming into the American market at a time when middle-class Americans are finding it very difficult to make ends meet. A lot of communities are adversely affected, and a lot of traditional manufacturing companies have been shut down, or some of their production has been moved elsewhere. It turns out, from my point of view, that there are a number of things we can do internationally that are both beneficial to the United States and beneficial to a number of countries around the world. And I'll just touch on them very briefly, and we can talk about them later. One is what I call entrepreneurial or innovation statecraft, which is to say one of the great exports the United States has is entrepreneurialism, is our ability to innovate. American companies around the world are selling very innovative products, are helping to build the capacity in other countries to utilize innovation. Much of it is derived from innovation in the United States. So working with other countries to connect American entrepreneurs and foreign entrepreneurs, I think, would be good for job creation here in countries, the Middle East in particular. The second would be greater connectivity to enable small and medium-sized enterprises, this country in particular, to connect to small and medium-sized enterprises abroad using some of these new internet platforms like Alibaba or Amazon, or even Facebook is being used more and more for digital commerce that benefits small companies here that have not seen it as advantageous to have a more open global system. If they were to have access to other markets, that could be very helpful. And the other markets, in turn, could have greater access to the global markets through this connective internet technology. And the last point is infrastructure. The U.S. needs to do a lot more to develop infrastructure in this country, but American companies also have the opportunity to take advantage of opportunities to invest in and produce infrastructure abroad. The Chinese are doing this with their Silk Road, One Belt, One Road policy. The United States needs a much more proactive set of initiatives to build infrastructure at home and to build infrastructure abroad. Good for growth here, good for growth abroad, good for American jobs.
Yeah. Pavlina, many people have talked about how the ineffectiveness of monetary policy. They've talked about quantitative easing, pushing on a string. At the same time, whether it's gridlock in the American Congress or the structure of the Eurozone, we don't see a resort to fiscal policy. Do you think we need a change in the macroeconomic policy mix to alleviate deficient demand in the advanced countries, and therefore, you might call, mitigate some of the fears that are inhibiting us from moving forward in foreign policies?
Pavlina, you got to just unmute.
Yes, I think that the conversation is already changing. We have rediscovered, if you will, the limits of monetary policy. I mean, we know that monetary policy is very effective in stabilizing asset prices, but it tends to work on the cost side. You know, lowering interest rates might reduce the cost of investment, but it doesn't increase the demand for product. And so we almost have to rediscover some basic lessons, you know, old Keynesian lessons, that we need to work aggressively on the demand side. So, you know, we hear these calls even from the corners of monetary, you know, policy, with, you know, central bank officials, from the IMF, that we need to have a lot more fiscal support. And as unlikely as it may seem like right now, I do think that we will be entering a new age of fiscal policy activism. The question is what that's going to look like. I mean, you know, even though, despite this obsession with debt and deficit, limits, etc., and austerity policies, I think that even the policymakers are rediscovering that we have exhausted our options, and we need to move towards more aggressive fiscal measures. And then the question becomes, what would those look like? My sense is that you can certainly, as it comes to unemployment, dealing with unemployment, we can certainly tackle that problem without necessarily much greater push on the fiscal side, just changing the composition of spending. So, you know, the kind of things that Robert is talking about, you know, infrastructure investment, those certainly require a lot more new appropriations, a greater budget. But they would be also smaller, targeted kind of employment projects, I feel, that will yield great many multiplier effects. And we need to begin to think about, what does it mean to have active fiscal policy? You know, do we just proceed on as usual basis, providing subsidies or contracts with guaranteed profits to firms, which is all well and good, but if we are not getting the employment impact that we need, then perhaps we need to quite deliberately create employment programs as a sort of a counter-cyclical fiscal policy to kickstart private employment, private sector demand, so then the private sector can pick up employment afterwards.
Okay, Daniel, what are your thoughts on the macro policy mix and what's feasible in the current political climate in the advanced countries?
Well, I guess a good preamble to that is I think the political environment is, while we're watching, changing, and it's going to be very curious to see how that ends up. But, you know, I think, Pavlina nailed it. Obviously, we have an inability to transmit monetary policy to pretty much anything other than asset prices, real estate, stock markets, etc. It's not really producing the boost to employment and the boost to growth that one would ordinarily think, and it's certainly not wiping out the tendency towards global disinflation that we've been seeing for many more years than any central banker ever expected to see it. So, you can look at this and you can say, well, there's a bunch of problems. There's, we're at the zero lower bound across the developed world. We have leakage. A lot of this stuff benefits, a lot of monetary policy easing benefits non-developed countries. Fine, you can do that. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is it's not transmitting. And you have to ask yourself why. So when you ask that question, you got to step back a little bit again and sort of understand that there is a big breakage globally in the transmission of capital itself. You can make it cheaper, but it's the old saying, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You can make money cheap, but if there's no point in actually making new investment in the developed countries, businesses won't invest, and now they have an exogenous source of labor, an exogenous source of capacity to tap into at lower prices. They're going to invest in those things. So when you look at it just simplistically, look at the virtuous flow of capital, which generally starts with savings, investment, employment, consumption, and then back to new investment, etc. We've effectively broken that. Where we're not in the developed world seeing capital investment on the part of U.S. companies is incredibly depressed. The only areas, in fact, where you're seeing meaningful capital investment is in areas that are actually labor killing, like software and so forth. So those are meant to reduce the cost of domestic labor. And since you can't move the labor, you have to figure out how you're going to actually use that labor appropriately. So when I say this has been broken, it's because we have continued to rely, and understandably so, on the normal meme that we've sort of adopted back in the late 70s, which is that government really doesn't have any role to play in the economy, and it's a question of making things attractive enough to the public sector, or rather private sector, to invest, create new plants, new jobs, new equipment, etc. The problem is that doesn't work because we have this massive exogenous source of labor that is considerably cheaper. The net of it is you have to then reconsider government's role. You have to actually look at the collective agent in a different way, and you have to say, okay, how are we going to take this excess capital? And it's hard to deny when people are throwing money at the developed countries at even negative interest rates that there is not a glut of excess capital in this world. How can you take that capital and actually put it to legitimate, productive, growth-producing use? The only way to do that is through what Bob just referred to as infrastructure. And I would say that in my case, I think I go a little bit beyond where Pavlina was. I'm talking about massive infrastructure rebuilding in the United States and in many parts of Europe. This has to happen. You have to take literally trillions of dollars that is idle, that is not producing jobs, and put it to work. And let's face it, infrastructure is a very easy thing to justify. All you're doing is present valuing work you know you're going to have to do anyway. Or as I like to say it, the bridge eventually falls into the river. If you don't fix it, if you don't put a new one up, it will go out. You know you only have a certain amount of time to do that. And so all you're doing is during a period of time of massive global oversupply, you are actually creating those employment opportunities simply by present valuing at the lowest cost of funds that has ever been extant in not only our lifetimes, but history.
Pavlina, do you have any thoughts?
Just one comment on infrastructure investment. I think that it is without a doubt that we need to rebuild the infrastructure investment in the United States, but on the tune of several trillions of dollars, right? And this is the case in other areas of the world. Now, I think we also want to be careful about thinking about infrastructure investment as ongoing, long-term employment-generating mechanism policy, right? What we need, infrastructure investment, is we need it now, we need it yesterday, and we need big push infrastructure investment. That's going to yield great many benefits for decades to come. We do understand that. But we are talking about a global problem of unemployment, and infrastructure investment is a bit difficult to fluctuate, right, over the business cycle as a tool for addressing unemployment. I think that as an emergency tool, considering that we have the needs and we've got the people, we can certainly marry those objectives together. But infrastructure is not the solution, the long-term solution, I feel, to the cyclical unemployment problem that we observe basically around the world. You know, you either need the bridge or you don't need the bridge. Rain or shine, it has to be built. So there's got to be some other kind of targeted employment mechanism that will absorb people in downturns and recessions and release them into the private sector as the private sector recovers.
I feel like we're missing an ingredient here. We've talked, as Daniel emphasized, that there's essentially a negative cost of capital. There's a savings glut. We talked about the need to alleviate global unemployment. We talked about a dearth of infrastructure investment, and it's not happening. What I think is missing is that in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, we're facing a crisis in the legitimacy of governance. People may want things, but they don't trust government to execute on those projects or those services. And so we sit here gridlocked in our legislative branch in the United States and in parts of Europe, where even when the need is as plain as the nose on your face, we don't do things. How do we overcome the distrust in government, say that Ronald Reagan marketed so skillfully? And I think, David, the question really becomes, if that psychological blockage remains to government activity, can the private sector lead the way to these new foreign economic policies that we obviously so obviously need in the emerging countries? Is it going to be a private sector led rather than a government led Marshall Plan? Or is that even possible? Can private sector be vigorous in the absence of what you might call demand stimulus emanating from elsewhere?
Well, I want to go back to what Bob said, because we've touched on infrastructure, but I think entrepreneurship and connectivity as well are key planks of this. And you know, it's obviously going to have some government role, but I do think there is a large private sector role. There's something like $2.5 trillion of unmet need for credit among small and growing businesses in the developing countries. There's not a shortage of demand among business owners of what they would do with some capital. Now there are blocks there. You know, commercial lenders might think those are risky businesses, risky countries, unproven models in some cases. So there are roles for government, development banks, others to mitigate those risks and help that capital flow more freely. I think the connectivity, you know, I think one of the things that comes up, you know, one of the things that impact investors like is that it is kind of non-correlated, as they say. So, you know, basic needs for food, for sanitation, for housing, those don't fluctuate with the global stock market. At some level, you know, the developing countries obviously fluctuate with the commodity markets, but the emerging middle-class consumers around the world have real needs for real things that, as we've said, you know, American companies have led the way in the innovation, but a lot of that innovation will play a big role in making those things more affordable. The financial innovations can make them more affordable as well. So I think there's a way in which, if we get back to basics, say, how do we actually provide those goods and services for all the people around the world who actually need them and who actually want to pay for them and are willing to pay for them, that there is a huge potential uplift on a kind of almost, historical scale of investment and growth around the world by driving that kind of prosperity down the economic pyramid and letting those people, you know, both not only work but also, you know, buy things that they need for their families, whether that's education, whether that's electricity, whether that's healthcare, all of which can become much more affordable given those innovations.
Hey, Rob, you got to unmute. You got to unmute, Rob. Unfortunately.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, Bob Hormats, on this question that I pose of trust or distrust in the public sector, probable aversion of using public funds to support other countries when you're hurting at home. Does this create an opening for the Chinese, who have what you might call the capacity, the tools of the state, to take the lead, a little bit like you talked about earlier of their foreign infrastructure projects in the One Belt, One Road program? Does this portend a larger shift towards what you might call Chinese investment, leading to win-win outcomes and increasing their influence on planet Earth?
I think it does. I think there are a couple of points that your question suggests require delving into. One, you're right, that confidence in the government and many institutions in this country and other countries has diminished rather considerably. The institution in this country that has the most credibility is the military, but most other institutions have lost a lot of credibility. And in part, I think it's the inability to deliver services that people want. And in part, it's a feeling that when the government does this, to the extent it does, it's politicized. It's subject to gridlock and inaction. So if you look at Washington at the federal level, it's different at the state and local level, where state governments and local governments actually do get things done. They're really the laboratories of innovation in this country. It's not Washington. And if you look at history, let's just take infrastructure, because I think we all agree this is a necessity and an opportunity. History is going to judge this generation of policymakers very poorly, because we've had, as this has been pointed out, record low interest rates, in some cases negative rates, not in this country but elsewhere. And we have not used this period of very cheap money to build infrastructure that is needed. Well, if we do more borrowing, we'll just impose future debt obligations on future generations. Well, to a degree that's true, but we'll be borrowing at very, very low rates. So the obligations aren't as great to service that debt as they would have been, say, 10 years ago. But the other thing is, by not investing in infrastructure, we're leaving them with bridges that can fall down. We're leaving them with an infrastructure that is innovative infrastructure projects of many other countries, which will enable them to create more jobs and be more productive over the future set of decades. On China, the answer to your question is, yeah, they're using this as an opportunity, this period as an opportunity. Now, they have a lot of reserves, they have a lot of money that they've accumulated, but what they're doing is building out an infrastructure in Central Asia. They're building out infrastructure in Southeast Asia. They're expanding their networks of oil pipelines and gas pipelines. So they're creating a connectivity, physical and informational and maritime connectivity in the region that is going to both strengthen their economy, because a lot of their companies are doing the building of all this stuff. It'll strengthen their trade relations and will enable them, they hope and expect, to improve their relationships with other countries. So it's certainly strengthening them considerably. And the problem is that we're, in this country, not fully getting the fact that other countries are utilizing connectivity. They're utilizing infrastructure relationships to build out their geoeconomic and their geopolitical relationships. And we're not. And we're pulling back. If you look at the political dialogue in this country, or what passes as a dialogue, we're pulling back on trade engagement. 95% of the world's consumers live abroad. Now, maybe that certain trade agreements can be improved, and doubtless there's always room for improvement. But the fact is, growing markets around the world are very important for American jobs, and we need to plug into those. And the last point I'd make along these lines goes to the Middle East that you mentioned at the outset, Rob, and that is, I went to a discussion yesterday among Middle Eastern CEOs and bankers, and they were saying, you know, what's really discussed on the Arab street today? We read about the Arab world, we read about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, very bad groups of people doing horrendous things. All that's true, and all of that needs to be dealt with. But the average dialogue among young people in many parts of the Middle East is, how do we get jobs? How do we develop new businesses? How do we grow new businesses? There's a lot in the Middle East that's going on among young people where we could connect with them to enable our entrepreneurs and theirs to get together. But to the extent, and you made the point earlier, to the extent they can create jobs, new businesses, use new technologies, that's both good economically and it's good politically. But the fact is, we don't seem to have the vision in developing a more creative foreign policy and integrating that foreign policy with our international economic policy to do that. So entrepreneurial statecraft, internet statecraft is good, as I say, for us, but it also helps us to utilize our strengths, and these are our strengths, to help create more stability and prosperity in other countries whose security is important to our own.
Okay. Daniel, it seems that the scale of this challenge, we're talking about tackling a global unemployment crisis in both emerging and the developed world. Is this something that can take place, what you might call as a bootstrap around innovation purely in the private sector? Or do we have to overcome our distrust and allergies towards government to use the fiscal capacity of the state in order to address something of the scale that we see before us?
Well, the short answer to the last question is yes. But having said that, understand that there is a huge role for the private sector in all of this. And a lot of that gets down to the issue of how big do you want the multipliers to be from this kind of spending. So, for example, we actually have a law on the books in the United States that requires open bidding. If we're going to build a bridge in the United States and borrow the money from the rest of the world to do it, albeit at very, very low rates, I don't know how you justify a continuation of a requirement on the theory that unless you're bidding globally, you're not going to get the best price. When we have overcapacity domestically, and again, you can't move the labor, so you have to at least understand that that's a constant. And in order to actually make those infrastructure programs as powerful and profitable to the economy as possible, you really do need to make sure that you're limiting your procurement to the domestic economy. Now, of course, there'll be things you can't get here. But at the end of the day, I don't know how you would justify allowing Chinese steelmakers to bid on building bridges here. Now, that may strike some as protectionism, but here's the truth. The truth is that if you made that proposal in a trade negotiation with the Chinese and you said, hey, you know what, we're prepared to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure, but here's the bad news. We're not going to be buying your steel. What we will be doing is putting a lot of people to work in the bridge building business, in the steel business, and in all sorts of other areas that will produce both services and goods in order to create that infrastructure. And guess what those people are going to do with that money? They're going to spend it, and they're going to spend it on consumer goods. And they're going to spend it on consumer goods in your country because you're producing the lowest priced consumer goods in the world. So I would, maybe I'm being a little bit naive, but if I were the trade representative, I would expect my Chinese counterpart to come around the table and give me a hug.
Well, that would be an innovation. The concern I also have is in a period of fear about employment, the escape hatch may not be just demand stimulus. It may also be the transformation of the individual. And in the United States, we've always prized ourselves on what you might call the rungs in the ladder of our education system. But in recent years, we're seeing the costs of college tuition going up, the cost of student loans going up, many people lamenting that they can't afford these things given their wages in the early parts of their career. And our public school systems have been essentially devastated. Pavlina, are we allowing people to, how would I say, overcome the fears associated with job loss because we've, how would I say, taken away the means to transform yourself? Or what role does education policy or reform of education policy play in tackling this crisis?
Okay, so if you look at the labor market, there are two very different kind of vicious and virtuous cycles that you will see in the labor market. High-skilled, high-educated people will not experience very prolonged or deep spells of unemployment. You know, people at the bottom of the income distribution, you know, with more modest means and access to good education, have completely different unemployment cycle, right? They're much more precarious unemployment, much greater difficulty beginning their economic life and sort of building that tenure and income growth. So education, of course, is a very, very important policy. The problem is that we shouldn't quite confuse education for an aggregate policy of creating jobs, because as well as good a policy as it is, it will only shift people on the unemployment line if we have not increased the aggregate volume of jobs in the economy. So we absolutely need better education, early childhood education, you know, high K through 12 education, college education. That's an important piece of the puzzle, but it has to be supplemented with a policy of creating jobs, a greater number of jobs. And you know what we're doing right now with our current policy is that we're straddling a lot of young people with debt, where we are providing loans, whether they're private or federal loans, but we used to do it a different way. We used to provide grants, and so now we've got you know, a young generation that is leaving high school or college and is wondering, is this paying off, or they are straddled with an extraordinary amount of debt. So even the way we do education has to change.
Okay, David, one of the things, you know, you were talking about innovation, innovation statecraft Bob Hormats came up with, and I'll go to him next. But what concerns me is from any given starting point, whether here or in developing countries, how do you jumpstart what you might call the building blocks of an entrepreneur or a scientist, unless people can move up into these knowledge-intensive sectors with some confidence and some substantial training?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, I think there's an interesting phenomena in the developing world of very much higher and growing rates of universal education, particularly for girls who have, you know, been more excluded from that. And I think, you know, as people get on that track, that in a sense creates its own opportunities. It might create also, as we've discussed, you know, certain frustration if there aren't opportunities. But there's an interesting phenomena. The social progress index, which we follow, sort of has an interesting takeaway, which is that economic growth actually follows social progress, access to education, better health care, rule of law, and all sorts of things. It's not that that social progress necessarily follows the economic growth. That in fact, if you have an inclusive economy where people can start to get on that ladder, that in fact that creates economic opportunities. And education, as you say, is the building block of that. So all kinds of efforts that get more people into school and then into secondary education and into job training for the kinds of jobs that exist will go a long way towards creating job opportunities. One sort of set of things we like is this whole kind of digital outsourcing in the developing world, where people are doing data entry and other kinds of much more advanced data services, even in refugee camps, for companies like eBay and others that need it, and it brings in capital from the outside for labor that, you know, at least starts people on the path towards better paying jobs. There's obviously dangers if, you know, people are being exploited and those sort of things, but there are good examples where people are getting better livelihoods, getting better training, getting on the rung of success, and it also does start with having a well-trained and educated workforce.
Bob, I think that Pavlina has a very good point that we can train ourselves and shift around, but if there's not adequate demand, we're still in a problem, and also without adequate demand, and therefore vibrance of activity and revenue, it's very hard to finance these education systems, both public and private. But how do you see the role, Bob? What role does how you say, a creative or innovative education system play in the world you'd like to see?
Well, I think Pavlina is absolutely right. I mean, you have, and I would add just a couple more thoughts to what she said. People who are highly skilled and highly educated do quite well in terms of getting jobs, in terms of upward mobility. People who are less skilled, less educated, find themselves sort of on the tail end of the cycle. And then there's a third group, and that is people who are skilled and educated, but not in the right jobs. That is to say, they're not jobs available for those skills that they have been trained in, for the kind of education they have received. And that's sort of a middle ground in this very fast-shifting high technology economy. So they can get great training in a certain area, but it's not relevant to the kinds of jobs that are available in the current environment. So you have to deal with that sort of third dimension of the problem, and that gets to the growth problem. And the growth problem is, how do you provide an environment for job creation world? And let's take the United States first, because as I mentioned at the outset, we're just not creating as many new jobs in this economy. There are a lot of new companies being formed, but many of them are not big job creators. And a lot of small businesses in this country are not able to start up or are not able to grow. And these are, we have 30 million small businesses in this country. Of those, 23 million are sole proprietor businesses. And then the other 7 million are divided up between companies that hire over 500 people and companies that hire less than that. The problem is this, that there are many regulatory barriers, not federal ones, but mostly state and local, and not safety or health or safety or things like that, but other kinds of regulations that inhibit you from starting business in this country. If you take the list, the World Bank Ease of Doing Business list, the United States, believe it or not, ranks, depending on the year, number 26 or number 28 in terms of ease of starting a business. Scandinavian countries tend to do better. Singapore tends to do better. Ireland, Israel, a number of other countries tend to do better. We have to look at this because we should be a model of opportunity, which is, how do you make it easier to create new businesses? And I'm not talking about fundamental regulations that you need for safety and for financial responsibility. I'm talking about a lot of bureaucratic things that inhibit startups. And I would also say that if you look around the world, and this, obviously you need to do fiscal policy. I totally agree with that. But I think part of the problem is that a lot of these companies, for instance, the Middle East, very hard for women to start businesses. Very difficult. In many parts of the world, there are a lot of cultural inhibitions to starting businesses. There are issues that if you're in a minority community in various parts of the world, it's very hard to start up a business. So this the Tunisian who set himself on fire and started the Arab Spring, was not able to start a business because, or grow his business because of regulatory inhibitions. So I think what we've got to do is figure out demand side programs of the kind we've talked about, infrastructure and others, but also look at some of the inhibiting factors that make it difficult to start businesses, even if you want to, even if you thought you could, for other reasons or regulatory reasons, it can be very difficult. So it's a very complicated mosaic here.
Okay. Well, when I look at the political environment right now in the United States, there is one thing that all of the candidates agree on, and that is to vote against the TPP. And so with that unanimity in mind, I guess the question is, number one, why are they so against the TPP? Is TPP, with some of its rent-seeking like qualities and intellectual property rights, actually an anti-innovation piece of legislation? Is it divisive in terms of a unified world economy, seeing that the Chinese are singled out? And what does it imply for the kind of jobs that would be created, the kind of quality of jobs in the United States, and more importantly, and I'll come back to Bob Hormats after asking Daniel, what is it that a trade policy to help us with this unlock and move forward would look like? What are the ingredients of a trade policy in the next dimension? Daniel?
Yeah, I'd go so far as to say that you have to look beyond TPP. The Atlantic Treaty is not doing so well either. The support for that is falling off by the moment. Look, clearly, 12, 18 months ago, the notion of the benefits and costs of trade to the labor force in the developed world has shifted. And that is the notion amongst the domestic electorate in both those places. We have a very underemployed labor force, and I think the magnitude of that underemployment is not completely understood by many policymakers. I'll give you just one case in point. You know, we talk about 14.5 million jobs having been created since the nadir of the crisis, and that's true. Unfortunately, some 45% of those jobs, and I'm not exaggerating, that's the real number, have been created in categories chiefly retail sales, leisure hospitality, social assistance, and what's called administrative and waste services. I like to call that temps and trash. And those categories, unfortunately, not only are low wage, but they are also low hour. So that if you actually do the math, those jobs, 45% of the jobs created, pay on the average $500 a week in the United States. And that is a very, very low level of compensation. And of course, many people have to hold down more than one of those jobs, notwithstanding the fact that the job count, doesn't look to that issue. So there's no shock, I think, that the domestic electorate, domestic policy has come out resoundingly suspect on global trade. Now, there are positive things you can do about this, and there are negative things you could do. You could get massively protectionist, which I think would be a huge mistake. You don't want to be the president of the United States who calls up Xi Jinping and say, you know, this whole WTO thing, it didn't really work out for us, so we're gonna turn tail on the policy. I think that would be massively geopolitically catastrophic. So we have to deal within the capabilities of policy, and I think we must maintain, relatively speaking, open trade. But we have a bunch of free riders, and I can point to exactly who those free riders are. It's not very complicated. You have countries with surpluses, current account surpluses that are far in excess of 25% of joint both direction trade, and there's only a handful of them, and China and Germany top that list. And then those same countries are also saving an enormous amount and not consuming. So the confluence of those two issues, where people are having massive surpluses and they're not lifting their share of consumption, they're not, picking up their fair share of consumption, those are the guys who you have to say, well, hold on a minute. We didn't expect this to happen. We didn't think this was going to happen, but it happened. And you guys, and there's about 7 countries, the rest are there's more. There used to be more, but the energy exporters don't count anymore because of the price of oil. But you look at the other 7, and these are countries that, by any measure, are free riding on developed world demand. In one case, it's a developed world country, Germany. And so you have to actually sit down with those people and say, look, let's talk about, we don't have to go as far as Keynes's Bancorp, but we have to at least sit there and say, we need an adjustment mechanism. And if you're not willing to do that, we're going to go item by item and see where you are actually running a huge surplus. We don't have to apply blanket protectionism, but we have to go item by item and say, look, in these areas you're going to have to let up, and we'll let you figure out how to do it. But if you don't do it, we're going to take action.
Okay. Yep. A little bit of what you might call critiquing the national system of political economy. German Friedrich List taught people for years. We have to take a more holistic system view. Bob Hormats, it feels like to me that economists are a little too mechanical, and they treat everything like a factor of production or a good or a service, and they forget that there are people involved. What do we need to do to these trade agreements to restore the sense of humanity? Do we need to raise the floor on environmental protections and on labor protections in some of the emerging countries to, how do you say, give the whole system an integrity and confidence that it's reinforcing human well-being?
Well, we do, among other things, have to do that. And there are chapters in the TPP that are focused on standards, environmental standards, with the goal of doing just what you said, Rob. But I think the problem is that we've looked at these in a relatively mechanistic fashion. I think the point you made. I go back to the point that many of us were discussing a little while ago, and that is we have internal problems in our own economy with wage imbalances and underemployment. The 45% figure is a very telling figure in terms of 45% of the 14 million jobs created are in these low wage, low hours jobs. And I would add to that also wage volatility, because many of them are part-time workers and they don't get paid. They don't always get paid. So you have the uncertainty of that. You have the uncertainty of whether they're going to get health care. You have the uncertainty about their retirement plans. So it's the level of uncertainty that when you add to the other sets of problems makes people very apprehensive about the domestic economy. And when you add that to foreign competition, they're even more apprehensive, because they look around the world and they see very low wage workers competing with them and selling their goods into the U.S. In some countries with very large trade surpluses as well, and current account surplus. So this does tend to be a problem, and I think that the notion of creating a TPP was designed in part to make the playing field more level and fairer for Americans. But I think that there is we go back to the question of, do Americans have confidence in their governmental institutions? Many Americans are not convinced that that is going to be the outcome. NAFTA, which was sold as a big job creator. Now, I happen to believe that there were a number of parts of NAFTA that were beneficial. There are a number of parts that also created more competitive pressures on the U.S. than were anticipated, and which did displace certain jobs in communities. But it was oversold, and it didn't do exactly what people thought it was going to do anyway. So I think there's a feeling TPP, you may be overselling it, and it may not achieve your desired results. The problem with it, then unless we get some kind of agreement that is considered fair to Americans, and don't forget there are 11 other countries that have to participate in this to get an agreement, the current one or a new one if there is going to be a renegotiation, without some infrastructure on trade in which the United States is a major participant, in fact, the leading participant, then we don't have architecture in the region that deals with labor standards or environmental standards or other kinds of things that we're dealing with state enterprises. So we don't have rules that we have shaped. And what's going to happen is that the rules will be shaped, but not with our participation. And you will have China and other countries. China already is leading another set of negotiations called the Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership, RCEP. And that will be the sort of dominant framework of rules and practices in Asia. So if we don't do something where we're the leader and make it work, And it may not be this agreement, it may be some improved agreement. We have to figure this out depending on the election. But something is going to happen in Asia, and either we're going to be a part of it or we won't. And if we're not, the outcome may be considerably more problematic for us than we anticipate.
Keeping in mind this idea that we're talking about humans, and we're talking about what Bernie Sanders calls a broken system. Pavlina, what do you think Bernie Sanders would tell us our trade policy should look like in order to, how do you say, contribute to the repair of our system?
Well, you know, you've heard his message. He constantly talks about the loss of jobs, and that's the focal concern on trade policy. And you know, again, I go back to the point that we need to relearn some old basic lessons. You know, every standard text you get benefits from trade are in conditions of full employment. This was a lesson that was very well understood when we were designing the Bretton Woods system. You know, at the time when we were when we created the IMF and the World Bank, the third organization that was supposed to be created was the International Trade Organization, which is the predecessor of today's WTO. And you know, the Havana chapter, charter rather, that created the institution, but ultimately it failed, outlined very specifically that the ITO has to deal with the employment and economic activity. I mean, the very first chapters of that charter dealt with the importance of employment, production, and demand, and the maintenance of domestic employment. So here's what we've got. We are missing this very crucial ingredient in the international architecture, in our thinking about trade policy, of how directly we deal with the fallout from trade in the labor market. All of these things that were already discussed. You know, like Robert was saying, we think in very mechanistic ways about this, that somehow the labor market is going to adjust. But the reality is that it doesn't. And so there are some real costs to free trade. So if we want to maintain the benefits of free trade, then we have to very deliberately on the national and international level talk about provisions to address unemployment that might result. So whether this is, like we were discussing, direct employment measures on the national level, Marshall Plan on the global level, or quite literally labor and firms and institutions and governments sitting together at the table and negotiating what the impact on labor standards, and of course I want to add environmental standards, in the absence of some sort of mechanism that explicitly brings these concerns to the table, you're going to get, you know, people are not going to be happy, and there will be this kind of backlash towards these trade policies.
When I've talked with people in China, some of them are very resentful of the opening in trade that we've seen. They say that foreign direct investment was done in a partnership between multinational corporations, their elites, or excuse me, and yeah, their coastal elites, and that the result has been to damage human rights and massively damage the Chinese environment. I don't know if that's true or not, but is there a capacity now, and David, I'll ask you, is there a capacity to unlock some of this cynicism towards government, level the playing field around the world? I'm reminded that they say 30% of the pollution that people breathe in Los Angeles emanates from the area around Beijing. Is there a chance to clean up the environment, stimulate the aggregate demand, and level the trade playing field through a climate new deal? Is that, or is that, how do you say, explaining, how do you say, more good than is possible?
Before you start, unfortunately, I have to sign off. I apologize. So.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us, Bob.
Thank you. It's been terrific. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I have to leave a little early.
Well, we'll see you again next time.
Thank you. I hope so. Thanks. Thank you all.
I'm sorry Bob is leaving, because I was going to make a big plug for his infrastructure investment, which I do think is really about can be focused around this climate deal. I think the number that was estimated to reach just the COP21 agreement in Paris was something like $15 trillion over the next 15 years, about $1 trillion a year. And as we know, that agreement doesn't even actually get us to where we need to get on climate. Some people are talking about more like a $45 trillion investment need, and that does, change not only, the energy equation, but changes the whole, financial and economic equation when you have a kind of capital shift of that magnitude. So I would, I think I'm like this idea of direct measures on employment, but I also think that what you really want to do is solve real needs, of which employment becomes the effect of those kinds of initiatives, and climate's the obvious one to rally the world around.
Can I respond a little bit to the direct employment? So I absolutely agree. Employment for its own sake, I actually consider it to be a useful policy just because of the enormous social costs that we bear. But these problems don't have to be solved separately. They, in fact, should be solved together. So we can have a direct employment approach that is executed very much by a private-public partnership, where the fiscal space that's provided to us by public funding and fiscal policy can sort of fund these programs, but they can very well and should be executed by some sort of public-private partnership for the purposes of doing these very big push investments to address environmental needs, other social needs. And what we find is the distressed communities, whether they're in the US or around the world, are the communities that are plagued by this multitude of social and economic problems. So what we need to do is simply to put the two together in a creative way, where we have the resources, the people, and we've got the needs, environmental, social, whatever they are, care, educational needs, and we provide them by mobilizing that labor.
One of the big concerns I hear when I talk to any given, say, finance ministry, is when I encourage fiscal policy stimulus, they will say, yes, but so much of our stimulus will leak over to other countries, that there's a kind of beggar thy neighbor approach to letting somebody else run up their debt to GDP ratio to stimulate my economy. And it seems that we may need something in the neighborhood of a, you might call a global Marshall Plan, a synchronized aggregate demand stimulus. And perhaps climate would be a rallying point that we all share, and as we all breathe each other's air. Daniel, how would you construct a global Marshall Plan to reinvigorate demand and employment? But what motivational theme would you would you use to underpin and inspire?
Well, climate and energy obviously are very good goals, and you don't have to think a whole lot about what things you can do in this world. Certainly, infrastructure in really underdeveloped areas is something that is going to be massively important from a geopolitical stability standpoint, or we're going to continue to have some serious problems. So, the infrastructure enabling folks in outside the traditional brick markets to actually become globalized, to actually connect to the global system. So those things are all very important. But I think you have to look at this as a little bit of a carrot and stick. Right now, there is almost no cooperation whatsoever. Right? I mean, we are at probably the lowest level of trade cooperation. It is truly a beggar thy neighbor world. Notwithstanding the fact that people whose job it is to negotiate trade agreements run around negotiating those trade agreements, the real implication is people only want what's good for them, and they're not really interested in doing anything on a global level. So this requires a little bit of carrot and stick. You have to go back and you have to say, if you were a surplus country and you had very serious and meaningful concerns, China, for example, only has half of its population urbanized. The other half is still subsistence farming. There's an implicit deal, effectively, with the current generation of subsistence farmers that they may not make it into the global economy, but their children will. Consequently, China is making about 10 million jobs a year in order to accomplish that. And the problem is that, if there's no downside to pursuing a surplus mercantilistic policy, they're going to do that. And look at what they've done with One Belt, One Road. This is a very important lesson that we can all take. They started their own Marshall Plan. They're looking to their Western and other neighbors moving down the old trail, and they're saying, look, we have excess capacity domestically. We'd like to utilize it. So how'd you like a new railway or a new airport or a new whatever? We'll finance it for you. Now, how do you say that to the domestic polity in the developed world? Maybe have the money. Maybe we have the money and certainly have the borrowing capacity to do that. How do you say to the domestic polity in the developed world, look, we're going to go out and we're going to do the same thing because it's good for us, it's going to create jobs, right? By building railways and airports and plants and energy, whatever, solar and what have you, for other countries. That's a really hard thing to straddle politically. So unless there's some sort of coordination where there is a consensus on what we're going to do and the level to which each country will benefit from that increased production, it's going to be a very, very hard thing to pull off. So that leads me back to the only conclusion, and I'm sorry to have to say this because this isn't really where I come from, that the only thing you can do is introduce the notion of, but if you don't, ...
Daniel, but if you don't, how do I say, what should you do?
Oops.
Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Yeah, Daniel, you were muted, so you have to unmute.
Okay, I unmuted.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I think I referred to that in the prior segment. You have to actually look trade code by trade code through the areas in which you are suffering from effective dumping, which is really what you're doing.
Yeah.
And by the way, I want to bring into this discussion that the developed world countries are not united in their opinion of all this. You do have Germany arguably benefiting from an undervalued country because they've linked up with their neighbors in a common currency zone that is able to export. For a while, they were able to do vendor financing and export to the periphery of Europe. That's not working so well anymore. So they're now able to export to the rest of the world with that undervalued currency, and they think they're playing by the rules. So it's a very, very difficult situation when you don't even have a consensus within the developed world about what to do.
But I guess what I'm getting at is something slightly different, and I didn't phrase this well. In America, people think that you're selling a policy that will benefit elites and not the public at large. Foreign aid is used as tied aid to help multinational enterprises gain, but it doesn't transmit to the American people. What is it that we have to do to convince people that there is a cooperative or a win-win game? Daniel and then David.
There's only one way to do that, and that is to say to the multinational firms, look, here, if we're going to provide you with this assistance, we need to make sure that the manufacturing jobs are domestic. And that's antithetical to all the free trade notions that have been exchanged over the last 3 years. 30 years, excuse me, 3 years. And that's really where the problem is. At some point, you have to say to the multinational, look, here's what I'm going to help you do. I'm going to help you sell your product into XYZ area, or I'm going to finance a massive growth project in that area, or infrastructure, or even financial infrastructure, or anything that you can benefit from. But at the end of the day, the service jobs, the goods producing jobs, those things need to, in large part, not entirely of course, but in large part, positively affect the domestic worker.
Yes. David, do we need what I'll call a small business administration innovation promotion program where those companies are obviously domiciled in the United States? And the second question I'll ask you is, whoever those multinational businesses that are benefiting, as Daniel talked about, do we need to make sure they pay taxes in the United States?
Well, to the first, I think yes. I mean, there are obviously a number of initiatives like that. I mean, I think the broad question is, how does, everybody agrees that this inclusive prosperity notion is really the most pro-business, pro-growth policy you could have, driving more income down the economic ladder so that people have more demand, as we've been talking about. They're buying more things. They're sending their kids to school. They're prospering in their communities. But that's not necessarily always to the benefit of the firm, or the firm may not think that paying their workers better wages is going to actually benefit them. Now, some cases there are. So you're seeing a lot of companies now decide on their own voluntarily to raise their wages because they think that will retain workers or improve morale or other kinds of benefits. But how does that get to be globalized? How does that become an actual policy with the right kinds of incentives so that everybody is sort of racing to the top as opposed to racing to the bottom? I think that's the policy challenge. I do not know the answer to that. Your question about taxing foreign companies working here, I think the other part of it is bringing back capital from American companies that is parked overseas. It's been one of my hobby horses for a while, which is, could that go into an infrastructure bank and sit there for 5 years as some kind of collateral or capital, and then that would allow it to then come back. I don't know. There's got to be a solution where those hundreds of billions of dollars gets put to work in some productive way.
Well, we've covered a lot of bases today and stirred up a lot of different dimensions of the possibilities of international policy, as Pete said at the outset. That's an alternative to the military and more built on economics and positive support and development around the world. I'd like to hear each of your closing thoughts in light of what we've shared today. What would you like to impart to our audience as your concluding thoughts? Start with Pavlina.
Well, I think that one message is that despite all of these enormous challenges, the problem of global unemployment, in my view, is not so intractable as it really seems to be. It is very difficult to nudge the private sector. It is very difficult to nudge our trading partners to do the right thing. And in that context, reinventing the New Deal model, to me, will be the way to go. A New Deal for the modern age. You go directly at the heart of the problem. You solve your environmental infrastructure, social problems directly. You provide jobs, and at a decent pay, you set the floor. So that's how you prevent sort of the race to the bottom, if you will, by establishing some basic employment safety net. Currently, what we have is an unemployment safety net, and we bear the costs that come with unemployment. So since it is quite difficult to coordinate on the global level all of these things, we can, certainly at a national level, set an example or lead the way of doing these very direct public investment, public employment, big push policies that then give great many multipliers for the private sector. That is the kind of leadership I think that other countries see it around the world. They will definitely pick up the policy, because it's true and tested. We've tried it. We know it works, and I think it's time to kind of return to that vision, re-envision it for the modern context, and move forward.
Okay. Daniel, your thoughts?
Well, as usual, Pavlina has hit the nail on the head. I can't, since we agree on pretty much everything all the time, I certainly can't disagree with her now. But the truth is that there's more to this riddle than just domestic jobs. And I think this has been one of the subjects we've been talking about. It involves other areas. One of the areas that I'm developing at least a little bit of expertise in is Africa. And what Africa needs is power. It needs electricity. It needs infrastructure. It needs plumbing. It needs all the things that enable a workforce to work. And it does need education as well. Here's the problem. You can say, well, we need to bring solar power, let's say, to Africa. And that would be a great thing, because a lot of areas are remote and could utilize it, especially utility-size African power. But the problem is, if all the manufacturing of the solar power cells goes to China, it's good for China. So how do you spread the wealth, so to speak, of a global Marshall Plan. And that has to be negotiated. That, in fact, is the trade agreements we need for the future.
Very good. David, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with both of those statements. So let me just add. I mean, I think that there is a way to think of this as a chance to rebuild a kind of global infrastructure, but the infrastructure in the broadest sense, you know, human infrastructure and education and the rest of it. The world, you know, adopted two sets of things late last year. One was the climate agreements. The other was the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN laid out. If we just took those as, you know, rough frameworks for what needs to get done, and put those kinds of investments to work, there would be a huge beneficial spillover for all kinds of other actors, private actors and countries, in just setting ourselves to those goals. There's no, you know, there's no shortage of demand for basic needs around the world. There's a few system obstacles that have to be overcome, obviously, but there is a chance to really unleash a whole new wave of global growth by focusing on the basic needs of a whole, you know, many billions of people that are entering the global economy.
Well, I think all of you have contributed a great deal today, and I think I want to close by talking about why I think the purpose of this conversation is so important. When I look at my children or their classmates or just children in the park as I walk by, I don't think about fiscal austerity as a means of saving their future. I think there's both assets and liabilities on the balance sheet that we pass to the next generation. And at this juncture, I think we need a new story, because the story that we have has failed. It's failed lots of people. It's failing in the realm of the climate. It's failing in the realm of inequality. And the fear that many people, particularly elites, feel about the likes of Trump and Sanders and Marie Le Pen is a very healthy warning shot. In the 1930s, Peter Drucker wrote a book called The End of Economic Man. It was his first book, and it was about the disintegration of faith in anything. It was about the disintegration of belief in Marxism, the belief in free markets, and the belief in tomorrow. A Chinese gentleman who I know quite well in his 80s has said to me, there's an old adage in China. People do not engage in revolt or in unrest because of their own circumstance in the moment. They engage in unrest when their children do not have a hopeful future. And as this, how would I say, seeming despair increasingly permeates our political process, I think this is a very, very important time to change both the narrative and the action, because I do think the alternative is essentially just like it was in the 1930s, an arms race and a world war. And I think it's worth all of our time and energy and courage to head off that outcome to make sure that's not what we hand to our children. Thank you all for being here today. I look forward to talking to you again next time. And thank you, Peter.
Wow.
Thank you.
That was such a moving and final summary. Thank you all for taking the time for this extremely important conversation.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you,
for
everybody.
having us. Thanks.